The southern cone of America has been the stage for epics, comedies, and tragedies. These have tested both the bravery and patriotism of its people, as well as the lowest vices that are unleashed in wars. An episode that stained the lush jungles, the endless pampas, and the mighty rivers of this region bright red. It was the War of the Triple Alliance, which lasted from 1864 to 1870, and it pitted the Argentine Republic, the Empire of Brazil, and the Oriental state of Uruguay against the Republic of Paraguay. The most violent and disproportionate war of its time, it left deep scars among the countries, especially within the heart of the Paraguayan nation. Join us to learn about the causes that led to this conflict, the heroism and unleashed passions, the victories, the military setbacks, and its fatal outcome, as well as the consequences that are still felt to this day. This is Rinaldo Carrillo speaking, and this is the New Encyclopedia. I remind you that you can give us great support so we can continue doing this work, simply by leaving your comments, liking this video, and sharing the material with all your acquaintances. Below you can also find a Patreon link where any contribution is more than welcome. Without anything else to add, let's get started. Even though the War of the Triple Alliance formally began in 1864, the seed of that great maelstrom had been planted centuries earlier, at the very moment of the arrival of the Spanish and Portuguese conquerors, and the meeting of the worlds. The Spanish had considered that the Rio de la Plata region, which divides the border of what is now Uruguay and Argentina, did not have enough economic attractions to settle there. Unlike the prosperous Inca Empire that lay beyond the Andes. Besides this reality, the small governorship of Paraguay, nestled in the Chaco Pampas plain near this region, was quite neglected by the Spanish crown. Thus, their Portuguese counterparts took advantage of this situation to place the flag of their empire over the brand new Cross of Burgundy, causing the first distortions and conflicts in defining the precise borders in this territory. Simultaneously within the Spanish Empire, there was confusion about the boundaries between the governorship of Paraguay and the Rio de la Plata provinces, which would later form Argentina. When the independence revolution began throughout the Americas in 1811, the new Republic of Paraguay continued to have border problems with its neighbors, Brazil and Argentina. However, in Paraguay, the rise to power of President José Gaspar Rodriguez in 1814 until his death in 1840 allowed this country and Brazil to maintain good relations. This happened because of free trade zones for binational commerce and Argentine leader Juan Manuel de Rosas refusing to recognize Paraguay's independence. He also refused to allow Paraguayan trade to have an international outlet through the Rio de la Plata. This forced Paraguay and Brazil to have an even more condescending relationship. Thus, Brazil would continually seek to take advantage of Paraguayan approval and the ongoing confusion at the borders to expand its territory and economic influence, just as Uruguay did. Between 1816 and 1828 in this region. For its part, Argentina always maintained a hostile stance toward Paraguay, not so much with weapons, but politically. So returning to the situation in Paraguay. After his death in 1840, President Gaspar Rodriguez was succeeded by Carlos Antonio López. Unlike Gaspar Rodriguez, whose administration historians have called a strategic isolation for having cut Paraguay's ties with other countries in the world to centralize power, promote self-sufficiency, stabilize the economy, and strengthen the armed forces. Carlos Antonio López's government will be marked by economic and diplomatic engagement with the world and modernization. All of this despite the obstacles put in place by Argentina regarding navigation on the Rio de la Plata, a strategic enclave for military and commercial movement in the south of America. Paraguay, with the advent of iron foundries, The development of agriculture, the stability of finances, the emergence of the first industrial plants, the railway networks, plus all the innovations and advances from Europe at the time. Paraguay was seeking to establish itself as a vigorous nation in the continent's heart. This aspiration naturally affected the interests of the Brazilian giant and the Argentine giant. These were nations that even before the war were constantly competing for hegemony in the region, and they didn't want Paraguay to be anything other than a small, powerless state. After leaving a trail of progress and a memorable era of 22 years for Paraguay, Carlos Antonio López dies in September 1862, and the leadership of the republic is immediately assumed. His son, Brigadier Francisco Solano López. Francisco Solano López is a highly controversial figure in the history of the War of the Triple Alliance. He was characterized by his staunch Paraguayan patriotism and the tenacity of his character. During his youth and strict military training, he was part of Paraguayan diplomatic missions that were sent throughout Europe during the height of the Industrial Revolution and the consolidation of modern nation-states. This widens the pupils of Francisco Solano López, who, continuing his father's aspirations, will seek to bring the best of Europe's commercial, industrial, educational, and humanistic dynamics so that his small Paraguay can consolidate itself as a strong nation in the region, a region that was on the brink of conflict. In the same year, 1862, when Solano López assumed the presidency in Paraguay. Meanwhile, in the energetic Argentine nation, the Unitarian became president, Bartolomé Mitre, who makes efforts to put an end to the Argentine civil wars and begin the process of unification and centralization, giving more prominence to the city of Buenos Aires over the rest of the country. For his part in the Empire of Brazil, led by the finely gloved hands of Pedro Thornton, there was economic, political, and military stability that made it possible for him to influence his neighbors to the south. However, the war ultimately breaks out due to Uruguay's turbulent situation. Bernardo Prudencio Barro of the Blanco Party led Uruguay. However, in 1863, former Uruguayan President Venancio Flores of the Colorado Party, militarily backed by Argentine President Mitre and Brazilian leader Pedro Tupyry, who of course had their own geopolitical interests in mind, ended up invading Uruguay to overthrow President Barro. No one expected Uruguay's situation to ultimately trigger the bloody War of the Triple Alliance. Meanwhile, Pandora's box opens in the southern cone. Paraguayan President Solano López, a close ally of Guerrero, opposed Venancio Flores' intervention, and he declares war on Brazil. On December 13, 1864, Solano López's goal was for Paraguay to enter Uruguayan territory to support Barro and thus free Uruguay from so much Brazilian influence. Brazilian influence that many Paraguayans saw as the main obstacle to expanding their strength in the region. In this way, Paraguayan military actions began in the Brazilian province of Mato Grosso do Sul, the same province that the Paraguayans took effective control of and held until even the end of the war. After capturing Mato Grosso, Paraguayan President Solano López asked Argentina's Mitre, who had been neutral, for permission to pass through Argentina to reach Uruguay. But Mitre refuses for two reasons. Allowing Solano to pass would break his neutrality, and, as mentioned, Mitre had a geopolitical alliance with Venancio Flores, Uruguay's new president, and his Colorado Party uprising. Faced with the Argentinians' refusal to let the Paraguayans pass, the Paraguayan Congress also declares war on Argentina. On March 18, 1865, a large Paraguayan troop began its incursion into the Argentine province of Corrientes. In April of that same year, they managed to bring it under their control, even though up to that point the Paraguayans had been winning victory after victory. Soon, President Solano López's strategy of fighting in such widely separated columns across those vast lands, combined with Argentina's power, Brazil and Uruguay would end up turning his luck around. A third crucial factor would be added to these. On May 1st, 1865, half a year after the war began, Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, which had already been taken by the Colorados, they signed the Treaty of the Triple Alliance, in which the signatory nations unite in the cause of confronting the Paraguayan invader. So from July of 1865, Solano López's victories would dwindle in his own hands. In that month, the Brazilians will defeat the Paraguayan squadron in the Battle of the River Achuelo. And in September, the Allies besiege the Paraguayan troops in the town of La Uruguayana. The setbacks that occurred in 1865 caused Solano López to retreat his position to the so-called Quadrilateral, a group of 4 fortresses and several kilometers of Paraguayan trenches that blocked the way to Asunción. The fortresses were Curuzu, Curupaiti, Tuyucué, and the most important one, Humaitá. Thus, in 1866, led by Bartolomé Mitre, the Allied troops tried by all means to break through the Quadrilateral to head towards Asunción, the capital of Paraguay. The Paraguayan troops are being defeated in most of the battles, but it was the war's bloodiest battle. Until then, the Battle of Tuyuti had resulted in 6,000 Paraguayan deaths and a similar number wounded. Still, there was some good news for the Paraguayans. Even though they were experiencing their first setbacks, they still showed the tenacity of the troops to defend their already cornered country. Examples include the battles of Yataiticora and Boquerón del Sos. In September, the Brazilians, without waiting for Mitre, go on the offensive and take the first fortress of the Paraguayan Quadrilateral, Fort Curuzu. On September 3rd, on September 12th, there is an attempt at peaceful negotiation in Yataiticora between Bartolomé Mitre and Solano López. This fails due to Brazil's refusal to make peace with Paraguay. That September, the Paraguayans defeated the Allies at the Battle of Curupaiti, causing 1,391 Allied casualties compared to just 92 Paraguayan losses. The Curupaiti defeat left the Allies hesitant for months. However, the past year's defeats had left the Paraguayan troops exhausted, who now had to recruit even elderly men and teenagers from their country. In addition, the so-called cholera plague, which had been brought by the Brazilians, kept both sides extremely cautious, slowing down the military campaigns. As for the War of the Triple Alliance, it's worth making a brief aside. There is often talk of the thesis of the fourth ally, which was the United Kingdom, according to some historians. The United Kingdom provided financing, weapons, and military advice to the Allied countries, receiving great profits from the sale of weapons and the hiring of experts in military operations. In addition, the United Kingdom had commercial and geopolitical interests in the region, interests that it thought it could exploit while the war was taking place. Like the cotton business, which Paraguay kept for itself, but the United Kingdom wanted to open globally. Given that the United States had reduced its production because of the American Civil War, at the same time, after the war, the United Kingdom would benefit from the loans it gave to both the Allies and Paraguay, which both requested to ease the effects of the war. This is undoubtedly an important factor to consider in this conflict. Returning to the conflict, the Allies attributed their recent defeats to Paraguay, to Bartolomé Mitre, who is eventually removed from command of the Allied forces. Luis Alves de Lima y Silva, Duke of Caxias, was appointed in his place. At the end of July, the Brazilians went after another of the Paraguayan quadrilateral fortresses, Tuyucué, which they took definitively without even needing to fight. Returning to the war in February of 1868, almost 4 years after it had started, the Brazilian fleet passes the Humaitá fortress and reaches Asunción, the Paraguayan capital, within days. As the remaining fortresses of the Paraguayan quadrilateral lose importance, President Solano López orders their evacuation, directing everyone to the capital. Through the province of Chaco, Solano López thus leaves the fortresses of Curupayty and Humaitá with few troops who end up being wiped out by the Allies anyway. Solano López seeks refuge in December 1868 in San Fernando Chaco region and orders a defensive line built at the Piquechiri stream. The Duke of Caxias from Brazil sees a water attack as impractical, so he surrounds the Paraguayan strongholds. Throughout December that year, Brazilians gradually capture and destroy Paraguayan strongholds, up until the Battle of Lomas Valentinas, in which Solano manages to escape with only 60 Paraguayans, leaving behind 5,000 corpses of soldiers from his country. Solano López knew it. His end was near. With no more obstacles in their way, the Allies enter Asuncion on January 5, 1869. If there hadn't been enough cruelty seen on the battlefield, Asuncion was the city that experienced firsthand the scourge of the Allied troops. Family homes were looted, buildings were burned, ransacked, churches, and even the European embassies themselves were reduced to dust. All the people of Asuncion suffered the outrages of this war, which began more than 5 years ago. Everything was destroyed after the Allied troops passed through. Asuncion was left so destroyed that the provisional government, which was later established as a triumvirate, could barely set itself up. On August 15, 1869, after an open, quote, popular election in which only 21 people participated, Argentina and Uruguay saw the war as over and withdrew once Asuncion was taken. Brazil, as has been seen the fiercest fighter in the war, would not rest until Francisco Solano López was dead. Meanwhile, where was the Paraguayan president, more disarmed and captive than ever, begins to head toward the northeast of the country. Gaston d'Orléans replaces the Duke of Caxias, starting the campaign of the Cordilleras. That is, the last battles of Solano López. Even with Paraguay barren, disarmed, and depopulated, Brazilian cruelty did not decrease. The military actions in different Paraguayan provinces, such as Ibitami and Piripebuí. They are especially remembered, among many other things, for the burning of hospitals with wounded people, nurses, and children inside, as well as mass executions and the rape of defenseless people. Even history wasn't spared from the chaos caused by the Brazilians. Part of the historical archives of these cities was used as firewood, and the rest was taken to Rio de Janeiro. How did Solano López respond to this violence with his army diminished, the cannons gone, and bullets scarce since August of 1869? Solano López had no choice but to dress children and teenagers in military uniforms. They were no older than 15 years old and logically were easy prey for the Brazilians. At the same time, some historians point out that as a result of the psychological consequences of the war, Solano López gradually lost his sanity and reason. Proof of this was that during the conflict, Solano López frequently believed he uncovered conspiracies among his general staff, and those involved in these supposed conspiracies were executed immediately. Relying only on his assumptions, Solano even imprisoned his mother and executed a brother. This, according to experts on the subject, led to the downfall of his army during the war. Meanwhile, Solano continued his endless wanderings, worthy of a globetrotter, leaving behind a trail of cities in ruins due to the attacks by the Brazilians, burned forests, ruined farms and factories, and a growing death toll. The journey, or rather the tragedy of López, ends in the Battle of Carocora. He was warned of the imminent arrival of Brazilian General José Antonio Correa de Câmara, but still chose to wait instead of fleeing. On March 1st, 1870, Solano fights. He knew this would be his last battle, facing a numerical disadvantage, 2,600 Brazilians against 409 Paraguayans. In addition, wounded, sick, and poorly armed, one by one, they are being neutralized in the vicinity of the lush and dense flora of Cerro Corá. Solano López was struck by a spear in the lower abdomen and was wounded by a saber slashed to the forehead, but even so, he kept on fighting. Under these conditions, he reached the banks of the Aquitaban River, where he was surrounded and ordered to surrender. He fought with his saber until the end. In a dramatic scene, lying on the ground and refusing to surrender his sword, a soldier decides to shoot him in the heart, thus ending the life of Francisco Solano López. Legend has it that in one of his final moments, Solano López tried to swallow the flag of Paraguay so that it wouldn't be taken by the enemy as a trophy. Thus, the Long War of Paraguay, or War of the Triple Alliance, ended. The last bullet had been fired, and coincidentally, it was fired to stop the heart of Solano López, a man of tireless patriotism and a tragic end. After the war, the triumvirate established in Asunción in August of 1869, which had basically been a government coerced by the Allies. It signs the peace and agrees to cover the war expenses. At the same time, Paraguay becomes a puppet country of Brazil, together with Argentina. They will divide part of its territory, with Brazil taking part of northern Paraguay and Argentina taking parts of the provinces of Misiones, Chaco, Corrientes, and Entre Rios, leaving Paraguay with its current territorial boundaries. For Paraguay, the losses were not only measured in square kilometers of territory, but also in the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives. Although it is difficult to give precise numbers, all studies indicate that Paraguay lost between 50 and 80% of its entire population. Some even suggest the loss of 90% of the male population between 17 and 40 years old. This resulted in a distortion of the population pyramid, leaving many more women than men, an increase in the aging of the population, and the destruction of several family units in which only the widowed mother and the children orphaned of their father remained. For those who were more economically fortunate, their fate was no different. The devastation, vanished industry, ruined fields, and lost commerce made repaying huge debts difficult. Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina became creditors of Paraguay, with the debt totaling nearly 66 million pounds sterling. It also made Paraguay nearly entirely dependent on Brazil and Argentina. Meanwhile, losing international markets and a distorted economy pushed the country into a prolonged financial crisis, inflation, and poverty. The political, economic, and social consequences of the War of the Triple Alliance for Paraguay would not be resolved until well into the 20th century. In the face of such delicate events that marked the history of a nation and an entire region, some people wonder how relevant was the intention of the Paraguayan Solano to help the Uruguayan Barrow in the face of the Colorado uprising. Wasn't there a way to sign an early peace that would have prevented so many deaths? Or what if both sides responded in proportion to the emerging conflict? These questions, and many others still unanswered, show just how complex the subject of the War of the Triple Alliance really is, and all the controversy that surrounds it as well. 154 years after the last bullet fired pierced the chest of Francisco Solano López. This open wound in the chest of Solano López was also opened in the heart of Paraguay's historical consciousness, and there are those who debate whether it has even healed today or not yet. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget that it's very important for us that you subscribe to the channel, leave your comments, share the video, and follow us on our Instagram account called La Nueva Enciclopedia. And above all, that you support us on our Patreon with any help you can give us. Thank you all, and God bless.